I'm ready to begin sewing my bias seam samples. So I have 4 different individual 4" by 8" rectangles, all blocked and pressed, ready to go. And then I have my pre-divided ironed bias strips. And so I'm going to start off with the double fold, and so bias strip. And so this is pressed into quarters. The first technique I will do is a stitch in the ditch bias binding. And so I'm going to take one of my rectangles and turn on my machine. And the first thing that I'm going to do is open up one side of my bias tape so that I see the first crease at the 1/2 inch line. I'm going to line up the edge of my bias tape with the edge of my seam sample, and I'm going to stitch right in that crease. Okay, so just like so, I'm stitching and back stitching at the beginning and end of my stitch line, and I'm going to stitch right in that crease line all the way down. So be really careful, take your time. You don't want to veer out at all. You already created the perfect sewing template by ironing that crease in the fold of the fabric. Okay, I'm approaching the end. Give it a little trim, continue sewing just till I stitch and back stitch at the end right here. Okay, all right, so now that I have done that, I should take this to the iron. I'm going to finger press it up right on that stitch line. Okay, and now I'm going to flip this over the raw edge. This is why it's important to press, because you really want to get as much out of the material as possible. What I want to do is make sure that my fold, or my folded edge here, is completely covering that original stitch line. So I'm going to come from the front and I'm going to stitch in the ditch. You should be able to feel through the back of the fabric just a little bit of like a lip or an edge of the back of the bias. We want to catch that all the way down. And so in order to do that, because we're stitching in that seam, in that stitch line, we need this to just come over like a 1/16 of an inch, just enough to cover that. I'm going to trim this thread because it's in my way. All right, so I'm gonna promote it to roll just a little bit. And now I'm going to stitch and back stitch very carefully the whole way down. I'm trying not to catch it on this side of the bias, only on the back, so I really want it to be in that crease. That's why ironing is essential, to really get in there. And you can kind of check it from the back and just kind of like smush it over a little bit. Really promote it to roll. And you should be able to feel it as well on the top surface, just by kind of running your fingernail over it, of exactly where that bias is. Stitching and back stitching at the end, and now this is kind of my moment of truth. Okay, I did a really good job. I missed one little stitch right there, but this is what it should look like on the back. I can see my stitch line. If you miss a spot, oh, it's like I caught it right there. If you miss a spot, it's okay to just stitch and backstitch and go over it and just fill in that little gap. You don't need to seam rip the entire thing. It'll never show if you just go over it again. But this is what the back should look like. Okay, so that is the stitch in the ditch bias technique. I'm going to move on to the next, and the next one is actually going to be easier. So this is my little double fold bias technique. And when I say easier, it's a lot easier. There's one stitch line, so I'm really going to open up my bias tape and insert my raw edge of my fabric, so like the edge of my quote-unquote seam allowance, into the fold, and then just close it up. Okay, and so what I will be doing is stitching at the edge of my bias tape. It'll capture the edge on the back side, and so I'm going through all 3 layers of this bias tape, the fabric, and then the bias tape on the back. So I'm really just sandwiching my seam sample piece into that bias facing. Okay, so I'm going to stitch and backstitch at the beginning and end. And then continue sewing all the way down. I have a habit of like wanting to sew too close to the edge, so I'm trying not to do that with this one. So I'm kind of lining up, I should line up the edge of my bias tape with the middle of that prong. Just to make sure I'm catching everything. But find a spot on your machine that works well for you. Okay. All right, let's see how this one turned out. So this one should actually look exactly the same on the front as it does the back. This is the front, okay? So I see my stitch line, it's about a consistent 1/8 of an inch away. And the back does exactly the same. So I'm capturing just the edge of the back bias tape. Again, you can see how this can really easily form like a decorative edge. You can see how that one was absolutely simpler than trying to stitch in the ditch and create a nice even stitch line that doesn't veer onto the bias strip or our like body of or shell of our garment, right? And it doesn't involve 2 steps. This is one. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the Hong Kong bias. And so I am going to take, we're going easier, even easier, and then harder. So I'm taking my piece that is ironed just into really 1/4, okay? And so I'm going to take 1 seam sample, and I'm going to open up my bias tape so that I see my first fold line, and I have my 1/2 inch of bias tape aligned with the edge of my seam sample. So I'm just going to open it up just like this. Stitching and back stitching at the beginning and end. Once I have created that stitch line, I'm going to fold it up. I'm going to finger press right on that stitch line. Again, please actually iron. And then I have already, since I ironed it into 1/4, I already have my next fold line pressed into it. If I open up this. So I ironed my Hong Kong bias strip in half first and then folded in 1/4. So I already have that half. So I'm going to fold this down and around that seam allowance now. So it looks like this. Now again, we're going to go back to stitch in the ditch. So I'm going to very carefully stitch in the ditch, but this time I'm not trying to capture just the edge of my bias on the back. it's completely unfolded. So I know no matter what, I am going to catch it, but I still want it to look clean from this side. I want it to really just, my stitch line should be in the ditch between those two pieces, and this should not like kind of open up and get wider than a 1/2 inch. It shouldn't look like this at like 5/8 or 3/4. It should stay tidy. So just carefully bringing it back to that fold line. And now I'm going to stitch and back stitch at the beginning and end in the ditch. Just like so. Okay. All right, stitching and back stitching at beginning and end. Okay. So when I turn this away, it should look like this on the front. So I have my bias, my stitch in the ditch. It's really clean. It's not on my shell. It's not on the bias when I flip it over. I have a raw edge of bias here. And my stitch line is pretty level, right? So it's 1 inch solid here, and it's about a 1/2 inch perfect. That looks really good. There's no ripples. It didn't move at all. And this would be really used in a garment, on a garment facing. So there has to be an end to our finishings. A facing is used to finish a garment, but you still have a raw edge of a facing. So this would, if this is the facing sewn into the neckline, this is hanging towards the body, this raw edge would go back towards the shell of the garment, towards the inside, so that it wouldn't touch the skin, and the garment would look finished from when you kind of unzip it or open it up, but unbutton it. Okay, so that is the Hong Kong bias. And now, lastly, is the most difficult, but my favorite technique. So this is called a bias facing. This is a really beautiful, clean seam finishing technique. It has a few processes, not too bad. So I'm gonna take my strip that has been ironed in half, and then the folded edge was also ironed when it was brought up to meet that raw edge. So it's not ironed into quarters like previously. It's ironed in half and then up, okay? So I'm gonna take this while it is folded in half and line up my raw edges with the raw edge of my material. And I'm going to stitch and backstitch at a 1/2 inch right in that crease. So all the way down. Okay, so when I've done that, my next step is going to be to press this up. So again, please use the iron. I'm going to finger press here because I'm at the machine. So you want to press right on that stitch line, totally up. So all of the seam allowance and the rest of the bias tape should face up towards the raw edge. My next step is to understitch this. So I'm understitching the seam allowance all on the bias side. So I'm capturing everything here. And I'm gonna do that about 1/8 of an inch away. So I'm lining up the stitch, the first stitch line with the middle prong of my foot, just to give me that 1/8 of an inch guideline. Do what works for you, however it works on your machine. Okay, so I'm stitching and back stitching. All right, when I have done that, my bias piece should look like this. So I've understitched all my seam allowance up. This is everything is going up towards the top. I essentially just did an understitch, so I'll see one stitch line on the bias side and 2 stitch lines on the wrong side of my garment or my seam sample. So I'm going to open this up. So I'm going to move my folded edge of bias tape and only focus on the seam allowances of the bias tape and the seam sample. And I'm going to trim the raw edges down from, they're probably at a 3/8 of an inch from that seam line now. It's a little bit shorter. I'm going to trim it down to 1/4. So I'm leaving the folded edge of the bias tape intact. That's really important. Okay. All right, so when I've done that, it now looks like this. So my seam allowance from that side is trimmed down to 1/4. My bias side is still intact, right? I'm working with that fold. The next step is to, with the iron, press this on the stitch line right here. So I'm really cleanly finger pressing this down. And now my last step is I'm going to iron from the right side of my garment, right, or my seam sample, and I'm going to capture the edge at 1/2 inch of that bias tape. What it's going to do is completely enclose all of that seam allowance, and it'll give me a really nice decorative trim on the inside or underneath of my garment with the bias tape showing. So I'm just going to line it up. I'm going to stitch it at 1/2 inch, stitching and back stitching at the beginning and end of my seam. When I am done with that stitch line, if this is my garment, this will be on the outside. So this will be actually showing, exposed. This will be on the inside. So this is why it's my favorite. You only have one stitch line, but you don't see a seam at all. It's completely hidden. The seam is on the edge of the garment. So if this is my armhole, my shoulder's here, my arm is here, that seam is really hidden. This is on the inside of my garment. It's beautiful, it's flat, it really well folds over and controls it so that there's no bulk. And it can be a really beautiful decorative element. I will have 2 stitch lines on the inside, 1 on the outside. And this is the bias facing. So it is definitely the most difficult, the most time consuming, but this is my favorite bias finish of all time. And so that was our stitch in the ditch here, where we see it on the back. This is our double fold bias, right? So it's just kind of our garment is sandwiched into the bias and stitched. The Hong Kong bias, where it is finished on one side, raw on the back, and then the bias facing, where we don't see it at all on the outside of the garment and we see it on the inside only.